In a small Nebraska town, the Mendoza family lived a simple, faith-filled life. Carlos, a pastor and hard-working father, and Sarah, a teacher, doted on their two children, Mateo and Sofia. Their world was upended when 4-year-old Mateo fell gravely ill. Initially dismissed as a stomach virus, his condition deteriorated rapidly, leading to a life-threatening ruptured appendix. Rushed into emergency surgery, Carlos and Sarah were overcome with fear and prayed fervently for their son's survival. Unbeknownst to them, Mateo was experiencing something extraordinary beyond the operating room. Mateo was a lively, curious child with a bright smile that lit up every room. He loved spending time with his father, shadowing Carlos on errands and mimicking his every move. Sarah, ever watchful and caring, balanced her teaching career with nurturing her family, ensuring their home was filled with love and faith. Their days were busy but fulfilling, with church gatherings, family dinners, and countless moments of joy. If you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith. When Mateo's stomach ache began, it seemed like nothing more than a routine bug. Carlos reassured Sarah, recalling similar minor illnesses that had passed quickly. However, as days turned into a week, the fever and pain worsened. Mateo's usual energy was replaced with cries of pain, leaving Sarah deeply unsettled. Her instincts told her something was terribly wrong. After an initial visit to the local doctor, who diagnosed Mateo with a severe stomach flu, the family returned home with clear instructions: keep him hydrated, ensure he rested, and monitor his condition closely. Initially, Sarah and Carlos felt a measure of relief, trusting the doctor's reassurances that the illness would pass with time and care. They worked together to make Mateo as comfortable as possible, taking turns sitting by his side and offering small sips of water. However, as hours turned into days, the situation rapidly spiraled out of control. Mateo's condition did not improve. Instead, it worsened dramatically. His cries of pain, once intermittent, became constant and excruciating. He clutched his abdomen as tears streamed down his cheeks, his frail body trembling with every labored breath. The color drained from his face, leaving him pale and ghostly, and his once bright eyes grew glassy and unfocused. Sarah's concern turned into a gnawing sense of dread. She knew something was terribly wrong. Her efforts to soothe Mateo felt futile, and every failed attempt deepened her growing desperation. By the afternoon of the second day, she could no longer suppress her mounting fear. Clutching her phone with trembling hands, she called Carlos, who was still at work. "Carlos," she began, her voice shaky but firm. "We need to take him back to the hospital. This isn't normal. Something isn't right." The urgency in her voice pierced through the phone. Carlos, who had been worried but hesitant to overreact, didn't think twice this time. "I'm on my way," he replied, already grabbing his keys. He drove home as fast as he could, his thoughts racing with the possibilities of what could be wrong. When he arrived, the sight of Mateo's fragile form confirmed Sarah's fears. Carlos barely recognized his once energetic son, now lying motionless on the couch, his small hands curled weakly around his stomach. Without a word, Carlos carefully lifted Mateo into his arms, the weight of his child feeling unnervingly light. Sarah followed close behind, carrying a bag hastily packed with essentials: some water, a blanket, and Mateo's favorite stuffed animal. The drive to the hospital felt agonizingly slow, though Carlos drove faster than he ever had before. The car was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by Sarah's whispered reassurances to Mateo, who lay pale and weak in the back seat. She stroked his hair gently, trying to comfort him even as her voice quivered with suppressed sobs. "Stay with us, Mateo," she murmured, her words more a prayer than a plea. Carlos gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched in silent determination. With every mile, he offered his own prayers, his thoughts repeating the same desperate request: "Please let him be okay. Please don't take him from us." As the hospital came into view, a mix of fear and relief swept over them. Carlos pulled into the emergency bay, barely waiting for the car to stop before jumping out. He cradled Mateo against his chest and rushed through the sliding doors, his voice steady but urgent as he called for help. Sarah was right behind him, her face etched with worry as she clutched Mateo's blanket to her chest. In those moments, time seemed to slow as they entrusted their son to the hands of the hospital staff. Each heartbeat filled with a mixture of dread and fragile hope. At the hospital, the severity of Mateo's condition became clear. His appendix had ruptured, causing a life-threatening infection. Doctors immediately prepared him for emergency surgery. Carlos held Mateo's hand as they wheeled him away, whispering words of love and encouragement, his heart breaking at the sight of his son's frail body. Sarah's tears flowed freely as she clung to Carlos, their faith the only thing keeping them from falling apart. In the waiting room, Carlos paced back and forth, silently pleading with God to spare his son. Sarah made frantic phone calls to family members, her voice cracking with emotion. Hours felt like an eternity as they waited for news, each moment filled with a mix of hope and fear, unknown to them, as they prayed for a miracle. Mateo was experiencing something beyond their understanding, something that would change their lives forever. During the critical moments of his surgery, Mateo experienced what he later described as a journey beyond his body. He vividly recounted floating above the operating table, watching the surgeons work frantically to save his life. He saw their concentrated faces, the beads of sweat on their brows, and even the precise movements of their hands. Mateo felt detached yet fully aware, as if he were observing everything through a peaceful, weightless perspective. At the same time, Mateo described seeing his parents in the waiting room. He recounted Sarah sitting with her head in her hands, sobbing softly as she spoke to a relative on the phone. He saw Carlos pacing back and forth, his head bowed in prayer. Mateo later said he could feel their emotions, his mother's fear and anguish, his father's quiet desperation as if they were his own. But Mateo's experience didn't end there. He described being enveloped by a brilliant light, warm and inviting, unlike anything he had ever seen or felt. The light seemed to pull him upward, away from the hospital room, into a place of indescribable beauty. Mateo called it heaven, though he struggled to find the right words to describe it. The colors were more vibrant than anything on earth, the air filled with a harmony that seemed to come from everywhere and everything. In this radiant place, Mateo said he met a man who exuded love and kindness. He had big hands and eyes that looked like they knew everything about me but still loved me anyway. Mateo told his parents, it was Jesus. Mateo described Jesus as wearing a white robe with a purple sash and having visible marks on his hands and feet, details that Carlos and Sarah found both astonishing and deeply moving. Jesus, according to Mateo, spoke to him with a voice that felt like music. He told Mateo it wasn't his time to stay in heaven and that he had to return because there was still work for him to do on earth. Mateo also mentioned seeing angels who sang in perfect harmony and a multitude of people who seemed joyful and at peace. Among them, he recognized someone who introduced himself as Papa Luis, Mateo's grandfather who had passed away years before. Mateo described him as younger and healthier than he had ever seen in photographs. Another encounter left Carlos and Sarah speechless. Mateo spoke of meeting a young girl who hugged him and said she was his sister. Mateo's parents froze, exchanging a stunned look. They had never told Mateo about the miscarriage Sarah had suffered years before he was born. Yet Mateo described the girl with incredible detail, saying she had dark hair like Sarah's and radiated happiness. She said she couldn't wait to see you in heaven someday. Mateo told his mother, bringing her to tears. When Mateo awoke from surgery and began sharing these experiences, Carlos and Sarah were both overjoyed and bewildered. Their son had survived against all odds. But his vivid descriptions of what he saw during his near-death experience left them questioning and marveling at the mysteries of life and faith. Mateo's words were simple yet profound, carrying a weight that neither Carlos nor Sarah could ignore. What had begun as a life-threatening ordeal was now unfolding into a story of unimaginable wonder and age. As Mateo began recovering, his stories about heaven emerged slowly, often in unexpected moments. He didn't sit down to recount everything at once. Instead, bits and pieces would spill out during meals, bedtime conversations, or while he played with his toys. For Carlos and Sarah, these details were both comforting and unnerving. Comforting because they hinted at a wondrous afterlife. Unnerving because of how vividly Mateo described events he couldn't possibly have known about. One morning, while Sarah was helping Mateo with breakfast, he casually mentioned, "Mommy, I saw you crying in the hospital." Sarah froze. She hadn't told Mateo how distraught she'd been, nor had anyone described her phone call to family members. "You were sitting in a chair with your head like this," Mateo said, mimicking her posture. "You were talking about me. And you were really scared." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. His description was eerily accurate. Carlos, too, experienced moments of disbelief. Mateo recounted seeing his father pacing in the waiting room, praying under his breath. "You kept asking Jesus to help me," Mateo said. Carlos's throat tightened. He hadn't shared those prayers with anyone. Yet Mateo spoke of them as if he'd been right there. The most astonishing revelations came when Mateo described his time in heaven. "There were so many colors. Daddy," he said one evening, his eyes wide with wonder. "The flowers were so bright. And the light came from everything. There wasn't a sun, but it wasn't dark." Carlos listened, his skepticism melting away with each word. Mateo's descriptions were unlike anything he could have imagined, yet they carried a purity that made them hard to dismiss. Mateo also spoke of music that seemed to fill the air. The angels were singing, but it wasn't like songs here. He explained, "It was like everything was singing together. It made me feel happy all the way inside." Sarah found herself moved to tears by these accounts, her faith deepening with each detail Mateo shared. One afternoon, while flipping through an old photo album, Mateo stopped at a picture of a young man. "That's Papa Luis," he exclaimed. Carlos and Sarah exchanged a shocked look. Mateo had never seen this particular photo before. It showed Carlos's father as a young man. "Long before Mateo was born. He told me he was happy to see me and that he loves you very much," Mateo said, looking at his father with innocent sincerity. The story of Mateo meeting his sister brought another wave of emotions. Sarah had carried the grief of her miscarriage silently for years, never imagining that her lost child might still exist in some form. "She said she's waiting for us in heaven," Mateo told her. "She's not sad, Mommy. She's really happy." Sarah wept openly, feeling a mixture of sorrow and hope she hadn't known was possible. As these stories began to circulate within their community, the Mendoza family found themselves both comforted and challenged. Friends and neighbors were captivated by Mateo's accounts, often asking Carlos and Sarah to share more. Some found renewed faith through Mateo's experiences, while others reacted with skepticism. "Maybe he dreamed it," one friend suggested gently. Carlos understood their doubts. He'd wrestled with his own at first. But the clarity and consistency of Mateo's stories made them hard to dismiss. The family's pastor, a close friend of Carlos, encouraged them to consider sharing Mateo's story more broadly. "People need to hear this," he said. "It's a message of hope." Though hesitant at first, Carlos and Sarah began to see the potential impact of their son's experience. Mateo's simple, heartfelt words carried a depth that seemed to resonate with everyone who heard them. As they navigated this new reality, the Mendozas leaned heavily on their faith. Carlos often found himself reflecting on the prayers he'd whispered in the hospital waiting room. He realized that those desperate moments of pleading had been answered in ways he couldn't have imagined. Mateo's survival was a miracle in itself, but his story of heaven was something even greater, a glimpse of a divine love that transcended human understanding. As Mateo's story began to spread beyond their small town, it touched hearts in ways the Mendoza family could never have anticipated. Close friends who had long struggled with faith found solace in Mateo's descriptions of heaven. Sarah's colleague at the school, who had recently lost her husband, confided that Mateo's account gave her a new sense of peace. "I've been praying for a sign," she told Sarah with tears in her eyes. "Your son's words feel like the answer I needed." Church gatherings became more frequent, with members asking Carlos to recount Mateo's experience. Mateo, despite his young age, spoke with a calm confidence that captivated everyone. He described the colors, the music, and the overwhelming love he felt in heaven, always adding that Jesus had told him he had to return for a purpose. His innocence and sincerity made it impossible for most to doubt him. However, as the story grew, it also drew skepticism. Some community members suggested that Mateo's visions might have been a dream or the result of his medical trauma. Others speculated that Carlos and Sarah's deep faith had unintentionally influenced their son's memories. While the doubts were painful, Carlos reminded himself that Mateo's story wasn't meant to convince everyone. "Our role is to share it," he told Sarah one evening. "What people do with it is up to them." Eventually, word of Mateo's experience reached beyond the town. A regional news outlet featured their story, sparking a wave of interest. Letters began arriving from strangers who had heard about Mateo and wanted to share their own experiences or thank the family for giving them hope. One letter, from a grieving mother who had lost her child, read, "Your son's story has helped me believe that my little girl is safe and happy. Thank you for reminding me that heaven is real." The Mendozas were humbled by the response but also wary of the growing attention. They had never intended for Mateo's experience to become a public phenomenon. Carlos and Sarah struggled to balance their desire to protect their son's innocence with the realization that his story was bringing hope to so many. As the invitations to share Mateo's account grew, Carlos and Sarah carefully considered which ones to accept. They began traveling to nearby churches and community centers, where Mateo's words often brought audiences to tears. People described feeling a renewed sense of faith after hearing him speak. "Heaven isn't just real," Mateo told one crowd. "It's full of love, and Jesus is waiting for us there." Not everyone was moved. At one event, a man approached Carlos and Sarah afterward, questioning whether they might be exploiting their son's experience. "You're putting him in the spotlight at such a young age," he said. Carlos felt his anger rise but responded calmly. "We're not forcing him to share anything," he explained. "Mateo speaks because he feels it's important. This isn't about us. It's about the message he's been given." Despite the occasional criticism, the family's faith remained their anchor. Carlos and Sarah prayed regularly for guidance, asking God to help them navigate the complexities of sharing Mateo's story. Mateo, for his part, seemed largely unaffected by the attention. He continued to speak about heaven with the same simple honesty, never embellishing or seeking to impress. "I'm just telling people what I saw," he said when Carlos asked if he felt overwhelmed. Over time, the Mendozas realized that Mateo's story was as much about them as it was about him. Carlos reflected on the doubts he'd carried before the experience, wondering if his prayers were truly heard. Sarah found healing for the pain of her miscarriage, finally believing that her lost daughter was safe. Together, they grew stronger in their faith, recognizing that their family had been given a gift not just to cherish but to share. As the Mendoza family returned home after yet another church gathering, Carlos looked at Mateo with pride. "You've helped so many people," he said softly. Mateo smiled, his face glowing with childlike joy. "Jesus told me that's what I was supposed to do, Daddy." Carlos hugged him tightly, feeling a profound sense of gratitude for the journey they were on, a journey of faith, hope, and love. The Mendoza family's journey reached a point of profound reflection as they began to reconcile the overwhelming impact of Mateo's story with their desire for a return to normalcy. Mateo's experience had brought hope to countless people, but it had also thrust their private lives into an unexpected spotlight. Carlos and Sarah, grounded by their faith, recognized the need to balance sharing Mateo's story with protecting the innocence and simplicity of their family life. For Mateo, now growing into a thoughtful and introspective young boy, the attention surrounding his near-death experience felt distant. "I just told people what I saw," he often said when asked if he felt any pressure. Yet, despite his youthful naivety, Mateo carried an inner wisdom that seemed to guide him in every interaction. One evening, during a quiet family dinner, he looked up from his plate and said, "I think Jesus doesn't want us to worry about convincing everyone. He just wants us to love them." Carlos and Sarah exchanged a glance, moved by the simple yet profound truth in their son's words. It was a reminder of the core message Mateo had brought back from heaven, that love, faith, and kindness were the most important things. It wasn't about proving what he had seen or defending his story to skeptics. It was about living a life that reflected the divine love he had experienced. The family found themselves returning to the small joys of everyday life. With fewer requests for interviews and speaking engagements, Carlos resumed his pastoral duties, this time with a renewed sense of purpose. His sermons, once grounded in scripture alone, now carried the weight of personal testimony and the profound lessons he had learned through Mateo's journey. His messages of hope and love resonated deeply with the congregation, many of whom had been touched by Mateo's account. Sarah, too, found solace in the return to routine. Her work at the local school became a source of comfort, a place where she could focus on nurturing young minds while also cherishing the community that had supported their family during their darkest hours. At home, She reveled in the laughter and mischief of Matteo and Sofia, moments that reminded her of the precious gift of their children's lives. One sunny afternoon, as the family sat on the porch watching the children play in the yard, Carlos turned to Matteo and asked, "Do you still remember everything you saw in heaven?" Matteo paused, his gaze thoughtful. "I remember it all," he said softly, "but I don't think I need to talk about it as much anymore. People will believe what they're ready to believe. Jesus said the most important thing is to love each other. And I think that's what I should do." Carlos felt a swell of pride and gratitude. Matteo's words carried a maturity that belied his age, a reminder of the divine wisdom he seemed to carry. It wasn't about the grandeur of his story but about the message it conveyed. That love and kindness were universal truths that transcended even the most extraordinary experiences. Over time, the family's journey became less about the events that had transpired and more about the impact those events had on their lives. Matteo's story continued to inspire letters from strangers around the world. Some recounted similar experiences, while others simply expressed gratitude for the hope his account had given them. One letter, from a grieving father who had recently lost his son, read, "Your boy's story gave me the courage to believe my son is safe and happy. Thank you for reminding me that there's more beyond this life." For the Mendozas, these letters were a source of both encouragement and humility. Sarah kept them in a special box, rereading them on days when doubt or fatigue crept in. They served as a reminder that their journey was part of something far greater, a divine plan that extended beyond their understanding. As the years passed, Matteo's memories of heaven remained vivid. Though they gently settled into the fabric of his life, he spoke about them less frequently. Not out of reluctance but because he felt the message had already been shared. Instead, Matteo focused on embodying the love and kindness he had experienced, whether in his interactions with friends at school or in the quiet moments of family life. One summer evening, as the family watched the sun set in a cascade of orange and pink hues, Sarah turned to Carlos and asked, "Do you think we'll ever fully understand what happened?" Carlos shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. "I don't think we're meant to," he replied, "but I know it changed us. It brought us closer to each other and to God." Sarah nodded, her heart full. Matteo's journey had taken them through fear, doubt, and wonder, ultimately leading them to a place of profound gratitude. It reminded them of life's fragility and the strength of faith, love, and hope to carry them through even the darkest moments. Their story, though no longer in the public eye, continued to ripple outward in quiet, meaningful ways. At church gatherings, Carlos often shared the lessons he had learned, emphasizing the importance of living a life rooted in compassion and trust in God's plan. Sarah found herself offering words of comfort to parents who had experienced loss, drawing on the strength she had gained from her own journey. As the stars began to dot the vast canvas of the evening sky, Carlos sat quietly on the porch, the soft hum of crickets surrounding him. With hands clasped tightly together, he whispered a heartfelt prayer of gratitude not just for Matteo's miraculous recovery, but for the profound transformation his family had undergone. He thanked God for the strength that had carried them through the darkest moments, for the love that had bound them together, and for the light that Matteo had seen, a glimpse of something far greater than their earthly understanding. Inside the house, laughter echoed faintly as Sarah and Matteo worked together on a puzzle at the kitchen table. It was a sound Carlos had long feared he might never hear again, and it filled him with a bittersweet joy. Their home, once filled with worry and uncertainty, now pulsed with warmth and hope. Yet, the journey they had traveled had not erased the scars, it had simply taught them how to live with them, how to find meaning in their presence. The Mendoza family had come to realize that their story wasn't one of finding answers to life's deepest mysteries. Instead, it was about learning to trust in the unseen, trust in the light that Matteo had glimpsed, and trust in the love that had sustained them through unimaginable fear and doubt. Matteo's near-death experience had opened their hearts to the profound truth that life's greatest treasures are often found in the simplest acts of love, faith, and connection. Through the days and weeks that followed, Matteo's account of what he had experienced continued to ripple through their lives. He spoke not with the fervor of one trying to convince, but with the quiet confidence of one who had seen and understood. His words were never about persuading others but about sharing the message he had been given, that heaven is real, love is eternal, And faith is the compass that can guide us through life's most incomprehensible challenges. The family began to approach their days differently. They no longer sought validation from others or worried about fitting into preconceived notions of what their faith should look like. They focused instead on living the message Matteo had brought back. They cherished the small, seemingly ordinary moments, meals shared together, stories told by candlelight, the soft murmur of prayers before bed. In these acts, they found a reflection of the love that Matteo had described, a love that was boundless and everlasting. Carlos, in particular, found himself transformed. Once a man who had quietly carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, he now allowed himself to be vulnerable, to share his fears and hopes with his family. He had always been the pillar of strength, but now he understood that true strength lay in the willingness to lean on others, to trust in the divine even when the path was unclear. Sarah, too, experienced a profound shift. Her faith, once rooted in routine and tradition, became a living, breathing part of her daily life. She no longer prayed only in moments of need but in moments of gratitude, her words flowing like a gentle river, carrying her closer to the light Matteo had described. Matteo, the center of this miraculous story, grew into a child with a wisdom beyond his years. Though he still played and laughed like any other child, there was a quiet depth to him that set him apart. He would often remind his parents, in his own simple way, of the truths he had brought back. "Don't worry, Mom," he would say, "we're all part of something bigger. We just have to love each other and trust." The Mendoza family discovered that peace didn't come from having all the answers neatly laid out before them. Instead, it arose from the quiet assurance of simply believing in something greater than themselves, something that transcended the trials and uncertainties of their daily lives. This faith, once a rigid and abstract concept, evolved into something more tangible and deeply personal. It was no longer a set of rules to follow or rituals to perform but a guiding light, a gentle yet unyielding flame that burned steadily in their hearts. Their journey had reshaped their perspective in profound ways. They began to see the divine not in grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, subtle beauty of life's everyday moments. It was in the embrace of a loved one after a long day, in the kindness of a stranger offering help, and in the infectious laughter of a child, pure, unfiltered, and full of wonder. These simple acts became sacred to them, each one a reminder of the love and light Matteo had experienced and shared with them. Carlos, in particular, found himself reflecting deeply on these changes. As a father, he had always felt the weight of responsibility, the constant need to provide, protect, and solve problems. But after walking through the valley of uncertainty with Matteo's illness, he realized that not every problem required a solution and not every question demanded an answer. There was a certain freedom in letting go, in surrendering to the unknown and trusting in the journey itself. One evening, as the family sat together on the porch, Carlos watched Matteo chase fireflies in the fading light. The boy's laughter rang out, a sound so pure that it brought a lump to Carlos's throat. He glanced over at Sarah, who was leaning back in her chair with a contented smile, her hand resting lightly on Carlos's arm. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of completeness, of wholeness. Life wasn't perfect, there were still challenges to face and struggles to endure, but there was beauty in its imperfections, a beauty that their faith had helped them see. Carlos's thoughts often wandered back to the night Matteo first shared his extraordinary experience with them. The light, the tunnel, the figure, these images were etched into Carlos's memory, not as mysteries to unravel but as a source of quiet inspiration. Matteo's words had been simple yet profound, and they had planted a seed of understanding that grew steadily over time. "It's about love," Matteo had said. "It's all about love." That love had become the foundation of their lives. It was no longer something they simply felt but something they actively practiced. They began to prioritize the little things, sitting down together for meals, listening to each other without distraction, and finding joy in the mundane routines of daily life. These acts, though small, were imbued with a deeper meaning. They were expressions of gratitude, a way of honoring the gift of another day together. Sarah, too, found her faith taking on new dimensions. She had always been a woman of prayer, but her prayers now felt different, less about asking and more about giving thanks. She found herself noticing the details she might have overlooked before, the vibrant colors of the flowers in her garden, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the soothing rhythm of rain against the windows. These were not just fleeting moments of beauty but reminders of the divine presence woven into the fabric of their lives. As for Mateo, the experience had left a lasting mark on his young soul. Though he continued to grow and thrive like any other child, there was an undeniable wisdom in him, a quiet confidence that belied his years. He spoke often of the light and the love he had felt. Not with urgency but with the calm assurance of someone who had seen the truth. "It's okay to not understand everything," he would tell his parents. "Just trust that it's good." One particularly clear night, Carlos found himself sitting alone on the porch after the rest of the family had gone to bed. The sky above was a deep, velvety black, scattered with stars that seemed to sparkle with purpose. He leaned back in his chair, letting the stillness of the night wash over him. As he gazed at the heavens, he felt an unshakable sense of peace settle over him, a peace that had eluded him for much of his life. The questions that had once haunted him no longer felt as urgent. What had Mateo really seen? Was it heaven? A vision? Something else entirely? Carlos realized that he didn't need to know the answers to these questions. What mattered most was what the experience had brought into their lives, a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper appreciation for each other, and an unbreakable bond forged in love and faith. If you believe in God and near-death experiences, subscribe to Life at NDE today. Discover inspiring messages from God through powerful near-death stories that bring hope and understanding. Hit subscribe now and join us in spreading the light of faith.